Academy Book Fair. And in this occasion, you had a chance to speak to someone about American foreign policy.
That's right, JD. It was the name of the book is National Insecurity: American Leadership in an Age of Fear, and I asked the author, David Rothkopf, if the U.S. is losing its footing as a superpower and if Americans indeed are feeling more vulnerable.
I think there's been a kind of cascading series of events. First of all, there was the body blow of 9/11, which created a kind of trauma that was very unusual because we felt isolated from past conflicts by the Atlantic and by the Pacific. But this was one where we saw the disaster live on television.
On our own soil.
Right, but also we processed it viscerally, right? You watched it, you saw people fall from the buildings. And so that was a blow. And then we went into Iraq, and that was, in the first instance, a sign of the vulnerability, the sign that we were going to go and reach beyond Al-Qaeda, beyond the Taliban, that we saw threats everywhere. But of course, Iraq didn't go very well.
No.
And that compounded our sense of vulnerability. We bought into an idea that a few people from anywhere at any time could do us damage. And that compounded it. It has ultimately led, for example, today to the NSA and massive surveillance based on the idea that any of hundreds of millions of people around the world could be a threat to us. Then the reaction to Iraq, the reaction to everything that we did had been so negative internationally that we elected Barack Obama as a kind of a reaction to the reaction. And his foreign policy record hasn't been so good.
Now, when you say that, would you say that there's a kind of crisis of leadership with the Obama administration?
No, I think there definitely is. In fact, I think if you look back over the period since 9/11, neither George Bush or Barack Obama is going to win any awards as a great foreign policy president. Bush, however, I think it's very important to note, and this is an important part of my book, he grew a lot in office. And so Bush, in his second term, took hold of things, changed his team, pursued the surge, changed his strategy, got better results. He did, but presidents don't always recognize they're making mistakes. George Bush came from a place in his life where he had confronted a lot of challenges in his life. He'd failed business, he had run for Congress and failed, he had had problems with alcohol and so forth. He couldn't have been president if he wasn't periodically able to say, I was wrong, I'm going to fix it. And with Iraq, he saw that it was going badly. He saw that the administration wasn't performing well. He pushed back on Cheney's role. He replaced Rumsfeld with Gates. He moved Condoleezza Rice to the State Department. He promoted Steve Hadley. He brought in Hank Paulson in the Treasury Department. He brought in a new series of generals. He changed to the surge.
Evidence that what was not working led him to make some other changes.
Right, and he got results. So all of a sudden, the last couple of years of the Bush administration may have been the best functioning years of the past 14 or 15 years of the U.S. government. So that kind of growth is
at least in terms of foreign policy.
At least in terms
domestically, the economy was tanking at that time.
Well,
too,
or it started to, right? The housing market started to, but I'm really focusing on foreign policy and national security.
Well, contrast that to the Obama administration. You don't see a similar kind of evolution in thinking.
No, I don't. I think the thing that has been disappointing to many Obama supporters is that he came in, he went through the learning curve years, and he didn't learn. He got to the point where administrations tend to grow, change their team. The stronger members of his team, Hillary Clinton, Leon Panetta, Bob Gates, they left. They weren't replaced with stronger members. The small bubble around him during the campaign got smaller and got more powerful. So that over the course of the past couple of years, you've seen one problem after another.
And listening to David talk about this, Nick, I'm struck by the fact that it sounds not entirely as if it is just taking a look at policy, but the people involved, almost biographical sketches of these two presidents.
That's exactly right. And it's not just a comparison of George W. Bush and Obama. One of the points that he made when we talked was that, in fact, the last two-term presidents, the last three we had, Reagan, Clinton, and George Bush, all had pretty good foreign policy successes in the last 2 years, even though their favorability ratings were fairly low at that time. He's not sure that's going to happen in this particular case.
Well, obviously, speaking of this particular case, that's coming up. The name of the book again, National Insecurity: American Leadership in an Age of Fear. You see the cover We don't want you to judge the book by its cover. We're going to open it up again. Part 2 of Nick's interview straight ahead here on America's Forum. The book we're talking about, Nick, National Insecurity, and how much does this boil down to individual differences between and among presidents?
Well, he really, David Rothkopf really makes clear that there is a huge difference in approach between the current sort of reactive foreign policy we have and the policies of the past. And here you have the second part of the interview where he expounds on that.
We got to the point where a decision had to be made in his administration. Do we go ahead and get rid of Saddam Hussein and create a potential void, or do we stop where we are? And many of the same people as who were in the administration of his son said,
Go.
But he didn't, because he didn't, Brent Scowcroft didn't, James Baker didn't. There was a balance built in the system. The system worked. And so that was a good example. In fact, most of the really successful presidents of the past 50 years in terms of foreign policy have been those who took the middle ground in terms of foreign policy. Richard Nixon was a very successful president in foreign policy. Dwight Eisenhower, we're now coming to realize, really set the stage for a winning strategy in the Cold War by not succumbing to the pressure on his right to go and confront the Russians, but instead choosing a path where they were allowed to collapse of their own weight. All those kind of approaches tended to work best. Bill Clinton in his second term moved in that direction, and it was much more successful than his first term.
Right, despite the fairly low favorability ratings that he had at that time, but he
but
was still effective.
But there's an interesting lesson in that, right? George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, last 3 two-term presidents. All of them were weaker in their last 2 years. All of them finished stronger in foreign policy in their last 2 years, even though they were weak.
Do you think there's any prospect of that happening with this administration?
Well, there's a prospect, but I don't think it's a good prospect.
Well, is it? You know, I hear what you're saying about holding the president accountable, holding this White House and this administration accountable. Do you think that it's also at least a partial contributing factor that we are living through more difficult times than maybe we were in previous generations?
Well, look, we're not living through more difficult times than the threat of global thermonuclear war during the Cold War. We're not living through more difficult times than World War II. Vietnam was not exactly a cakewalk. We've faced a lot of things. There are a lot of mid-level problems that we face. Crimea, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, South China Sea, North Korea. And in facing all of these things, we've learned something. And that is, the United States is really good at global thermonuclear war. We're really good at meaningless gestures. We're just not so good at the middle game. And the middle game is where most foreign policy happens.
What needs to happen then for American leadership to rise again?
Well, I think we have to recognize that we can't embrace a gated community foreign policy. We can't say the problems that happen far away won't affect us here. That was the lesson of 9/11. There were problems on the other side of the world, and they affected, lower Manhattan. They affected Washington, D.C. They affected the middle of the country as well. And I think we have to go and say, if we don't want to do it alone, we have to be better at building coalitions. Not this kind of coalition that we've got currently fighting ISIS. FAUX, exactly, where you've got a bunch of people committing, a few trucks, a few people behind the lines, but nobody willing to commit troops on the ground. But real coalitions where we use real leverage. We have to be aggressive in blocking and tackling in diplomacy. Stopping the Qataris from underwriting extremism, stopping the Turks from underwriting extremism, using the leverage we get from an Iran negotiation to gain more influence with, say, Assad, as opposed to the other way around, where we seem to want the Iran nuclear negotiations so much that we're cutting them and their ally Assad a little bit of slack, right? And so it's not a question of all in, all out. It's a question of, do we lean in a little more? Do we have more of an aspirational foreign policy, or do we have a defensive and reactive foreign policy?
The name of the book again, National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear by David Rothkopf. Our thanks to Nick Tate. Nick, stick around. There's more on America's Forum.